Hello and welcome back to 28storms.com. This is your severe weather analysis for Friday, April 8th, 2011. Here is the latest day 1 outlook from the Storm Prediction Center, and they have a very large area outlined for the possibility of a slight risk of severe weather from much of central Oklahoma upward toward Kansas, extending eastward all the way into portions of West Virginia, and North Carolina. Today's biggest threat will obviously be the chance of significant sized hail, and of course, your greatest probabilities are over extreme northeast Tennessee and much of Kentucky. But there's also the possibility of damaging winds. Again, the highest probabilities are in that same general area. And you also have a slight risk of tornadoes, although that's more of the third most interesting threat for today. But nonetheless, we do have a 5% risk extending from Kentucky all the way into the Central Plains. Now, the main driver or mechanism behind today's severe weather, and actually a very active severe weather period over the next few days, is this long wave trough over much of the western United States, and it's also kicking out some shortwave impulses that's riding out of the Four Corners region and Mexico, and it's streaming on into the central United States. Here is the latest 500 millibar RUC analysis, and as you can see, we have a pretty strong dominant westerly flow, as denoted by all of the wind vectors. However, near the surface, we have a couple surface boundaries to contend with. We have the stalled out frontal boundary over the Tennessee and Ohio Valley. As you can see, it's draped across over here and extends all the way westward into Kansas, where it becomes a warm front. And it's beginning to lift north because we have a secondary area of low pressure beginning to develop over western Oklahoma. Now, as mentioned before, there's not just the threat of damaging winds and hail, but there is a marginal tornado risk today. And as outlined by the Storm Prediction Center, that risk is generally in the warm sector just south of this surface boundary. And you can occasionally get more southerly winds just south of this boundary, which will create enough directional wind shear to spin up some tornadoes. Because as we just saw, the 500 millibar winds are more out of the west, and if we have surface winds more out of the south, then we'll have a fair amount of directional wind shear near the surface. However, if you look at the latest surface observations, the winds are currently backing more toward the southwest near the surface, which would be indicative of not as good enough wind shear that we would typically want to see if we're looking for tornadogenesis. Over toward the west, however, we're beginning to see more southeasterly winds ahead of that secondary surface low formation, and we also have convergence developing along the dry line, which is the barrier or line between the dry and very warm air and moist air further toward the east. So this is definitely going to be the primary focal point for thunderstorm initiation toward the late afternoon hours. But further off to the west, we also have a cap that we need to keep in mind, so we'll take a look at that in just a moment. This is the latest national radar as of 3:40 Central Time. As you can see, there's already severe thunderstorms beginning to develop over eastern Kentucky into West Virginia and Virginia, and any of those isolated severe thunderstorms have the potential to produce hail and damaging wind. Off to the west over Kansas and Oklahoma, it's still fairly quiet. Much of what you're seeing is ground clutter, although some elevated convection is now beginning to develop over central Kansas. Now, this is the latest 1-hour RUC precipitation forecasts, and as you can see, it is trying to break out some precipitation over southwest Oklahoma. And as we go into the later afternoon hours, the precipitation really increases across much of central Oklahoma toward Oklahoma City into areas further north. So it's just a matter of will this cap really break or not, because the RUC is definitely showing that cap beginning to break. This was the 12Z sounding out of Norman, Oklahoma. And as you can see, during the early morning hours, there was quite a significant cap. As you can see, around between 850 and 870 millibars, there was a very strong temperature inversion above the surface, meaning that air temperatures were slightly warmer above ground level, and therefore you're not going to get much available lift. And if you don't have enough lift, then thunderstorms will not be able to form. Now, of course, during the afternoon hours, the surface temperatures will have increased significantly since the timing of this sounding, but nevertheless, there's still been major question marks as to whether or not we would see a significant weakening of that temperature inversion. This is the 4 p.m. forecast sounding from the RUC, and as you can see, at least based on this model, the RUC has significantly weakened the temperature inversion enough so that we can actually have convective initiation. Now, the only problem in terms of tornado genesis or lack thereof is if you look very closely, the spread between the dew point and surface temperature is quite extreme. And as noted by the Storm Prediction Center, we're having dew point depressions rather in excess of 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And with such dew point depressions that high, your lifted condensation levels are probably going to be too high for any type of tornadic activity. All that being said, though, the CAPE values are more than strong enough or high enough for severe thunderstorms to develop. We have CAPE values in excess of 3 to 4,000 just south of the stationary front, which you can also point out on this map, draped across central Kansas into Missouri and on into the Ohio and Tennessee Valley areas. So therefore, the potential for significant hail and damaging winds does appear to be valid as long as we can get severe thunderstorm initiation to begin. Now, the severe threat will not only continue throughout the weekend, but in fact it will actually increase. This is the day 2 outlook, of course, for your Saturday, and there's a rather significant threat of severe weather over northern Iowa into southern Minnesota and Wisconsin. It looks like the threat will be multimodal with a chance of tornadoes, hail, and damaging winds. And last but not least, it looks as if Sunday may actually be our most active day in terms of severe weather. The Storm Prediction Center already has a moderate risk out for portions of the highlighted area, and as you can see, the area is hatched with 45% probabilities of severe weather, and that's fairly high for a day 3 outlook. And if all things remain the same, I would not at all be surprised to see a high risk be issued, and that would be the first high risk of the United States 2011 severe weather season. So once again, be on guard if you live in the Midwest. It looks like it's going to be an active few days, and expect more updates from us in the coming hours and into the weekend. So thanks again for visiting 28storms.com. Please spread the word and check back soon for more comprehensive and extensive severe weather analysis and updates.